A quick little video here on a question that I got with this prism. So, as a review, every single pitcher competes by throwing a prism at a hitter, and a prism is just a fancy way to say a box, right? And this front edge is his fastball. It's the fastest thing that can get on you, and then this back edge is either the changeup or the curveball, but something off speed. And then, of course, every pitcher competes with a width and a height. You know, how they command the strike zone in and out and how they challenge you up and down. And so the pitcher has this prism that he throws at hitters. And as hitters climb the baseball ladder, the pitcher's prism evolves. It becomes very, very deep and wide and tall. And an 8-year-old does not have to compete with the same prism as a 21-year-old. And the trick becomes, how do we equip that older player so he's able to compete with these very complex prisms, right? Like elite fastballs and great changeups and unpredictable pitches, the 2-0 curveball. It's really, really challenging at the highest of levels. And most coaches know, like, hey, that's what we're in it for. We're in it to develop these players so they keep playing and keep having success. But what I want to talk about is, how do we do that? What's the nature of this coaching business? So the first thing we have to understand is this idea of the zone of proximal development. And all that really means is, we recognize that our athletes can't do certain things yet. Okay, so we know that's true. We know our task is to help them. There are certain things they can do, and then this middle ground is where we live. How can we transition them to next, knowing what they can do now, right? Like, how do we transition them, and what's our role? Because we know they have to improve. So this in the green light hitting, I talk about degrees of freedom. And when my brother and I would talk and we would work with players, many times we would laugh at the end of the night and say, it all just boils down to degrees of freedom, degrees of freedom. And degrees of freedom is just a fancy way of saying, how many links does a kid have in the chain? How athletic is he? But it's more than just physical movements. It's the whole mind and body degrees of freedom. So if you think about the act of hitting, hitters have to first scan. They have to use their eyes, and they have to see something, and they have to scan their field of vision and say, what is it that's coming at me? And when they're really young, that's a really simple task. Scanning is just seeing the ball coming at me, and they have to be prepared to swing. But as you start to climb the ladder, you start to recognize, well, not only do I have to scan, but then I have to decide. And then once I decide, now I'm moving or I'm not moving. And then the other piece is after I'm done moving or not moving, I have to interpret what just happened. And that becomes the act of hitting, this idea of all these things together. And my brother made a comment the other day. He goes, I find it remarkable that Tony Gwynn and Ted Williams have an incredible memory, that they can remember these at-bats. When you hear them talk, they talk just matter-of-factly about at-bats that happened 15 years ago. And that's this last piece. I mean, in my opinion, there are experts out there that are training us to what to see and what to look for and how to grow in that area of degrees of freedom. And then the deciding, I'd like to think that the idea of reaction times and choice and recognition and simple, and we can help assist people with deciding, and then moving and not moving. That's where like 90% of hitting instruction is. How do you move? That's the swing. That's your mechanics. But so very few talk about interpreting. How do you interpret the act of hitting the ball? And the other day I mentioned someone that you should journal. And they're like, yeah, you should journal. Now, some people don't like journaling. They just like to they think that actually writing it down compromises the memory, and that's fine too. I mean, but at some point you have to recognize that great hitters make adjustments faster. And what that means is they do a better job of interpreting. That young kids, they just do these first three and then never even consider what happened, or they're not interpreting the feedback. So let's talk about like how do you help people combat this prism. The first thing I want to say is batting practice in its general nature is really, I mean, if you've got a guy that's throwing good BP and he's always in the zone, there's a really good chance that you're only working on this moving and not moving. I mean, you might not even be scanning. You might immediately go on autopilot. He's throwing me the same pitch, and you might not even be deciding, right? So one of the things that we would do when I work with young players is, as I go into batting practice and I tell them I'm intentionally throwing you balls. Like I am going to be a 9-year-old pitcher or a 10-year-old pitcher or an 11-year-old pitcher. I am intentionally throwing you balls, and all I'm trying to do is engage these first three pieces. I want you scanning, I want you deciding, and I want you moving and not moving. And you can take those for granted at the higher level. I wouldn't necessarily think that you would ever consider doing that in a group setting. I mean, that wastes time. But if you're in an individual setting, I absolutely would encourage balls, intentional balls. So you ask your kids to engage in those first three aspects. So you got to be really careful if you're just giving that front edge BP where you're just throwing the same speed. Now, the other thing you got to be really careful of is I'm always skeptical when pitchers go, "Hey, I'm going to throw you curveballs, just random curveballs." So now all of a sudden you've got fastballs and curveballs, but you've got no count, right? So whenever you go unpredictable with a no count, you're not allowing for interpretation. Okay. One of the things that we want to do is we want to train our young hitters to recognize, oh, he throws me curveballs in the 0-1 count. He throws me curveballs in the 0-2 count. And then the more that we can anticipate that, the more the prism starts to shrink. Whenever you don't have any clues as to what he's throwing you, you get in the batter's box, and this prism is like so deep that you've got no strategy to compete against this fastball and his off speed. And then what happens is when you have no strategy, you sit somewhere in the middle, and then the fastball beats you and you're out in front of the off speed. And then you'll hear people say, "Oh, he's in between. He's in between." Well, that's what he means, is that he's got no strategy to compete because he's not processing what it is, how he's being pitched. And then they're in between, and then they're not on the front edge, and they're out in front of the back edge. So this idea of shrinking the pitcher's prism, giving a hitter a fighting chance, requires all of these things. And if you ask a batter after an at bat, what were you looking for in the 1-1 count, and he goes, and a great answer is, I'm just trying to see it big. I'm just trying to see it big. I think that's a great way to compete in the batter's box. Seeing it big means like you're desperately trying to scan, and you're trying to see it and then make a move off of it. I think when we restrict our focus and we try to be too precise, I think that's when we get frozen and we get in the middle, right? And then the fastball beats us and we're out in front. So I love the idea of seeing it big. I do love the idea as you become more and more competent in your movement patterns, right? If you want to train movement only, by all means, just throw a fastball. By all means, just throw a curveball. You want to work on your movement patterns. And if as you become more competent in your movement patterns, then you can sit on certain off speed. But if you've never proven that you could hit a curveball, you can't look for a curveball. So I don't know if this helps. I hope it helps. There's lots of strategies, but the big piece is, recognize that these four things all go into how to train a hitter. It's scanning, deciding, moving, not moving, and then interpreting. And our role as a coach lives here, okay? And we need to be really, really precise in knowing what our kids can do and what we're asking them to do. and not asking them to do too much before they're ready.